It's amazing to see this room filled like this. It's super exciting. I'm going to MC the event or moderate the event. So the first thing I was asked to do is actually tell you about a series of events that are part of the McDermott Award. You're now at the event called Future of the Library. The next one will be the keynote lecture by David Adjaye on March 29th. Then we're going to be discussing Future of the Campus, March 30th. And finally, a panel on the future of the museum on April 28th. So that's sort of the big picture of what's going to happen. But today, it's a great pleasure for me to moderate a conversation on the future of the library, its architectural possibilities, cultural, organizational, and technological pressures on it as an institution, and various forms of magic it presents. Magic was a word that came up many times last night in the conversation that I got to eavesdrop on of the MIT Library Task Force with some of the panelists tonight. So I'll try not to sound like there's an inside joke about this. But magic was in that event related to the material and spatial dimension of the library, to its architecture, to the encounter with the material instantiation of knowledge in books and other information objects. I learned that term. And magic seemed apt as at least one of the terms by which to describe the socializing dimension of the library, being in it together. So for now, I will introduce the participants in this event via fairly standard bio, and I hope you won't mind that, so that we can save space, time for these pretty talkative enthusiasts of the library, of library architecture, and I'm relieved to say of the book. First, and it may not entirely follow the order that we've been given for the presentations, but I'll introduce David Adjaye, who set up his first office in 1994, and a few years later, in 2000, founded Adjaye Associates, and immediately won several prestigious commissions. In Oslo, he designed the Nobel Peace Center. In London, his design for the Whitechapel Idea Stores pioneered a new approach to the provision of information services. Later projects in London included the Stephen Lawrence Center with teaching and community spaces, Rivington Place, an exhibition venue and resource center, and the Bernie Grant Arts Center for Performing Arts. The office, Adjaye Associates, now has offices in London, New York, and Accra, and is working throughout the world. In the United States, Adjaye is the designer of a new home for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, 2 public libraries in Washington, the Sugar Hill Low-Income Housing Development in Harlem, and the redesigned Ethelbert Cooper Gallery of African and African American Art at Harvard University's Hutchins Center. Adjaye Associates' largest completed project to date is the Moscow School of Management Skolkovo, while firm's current projects include the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall in Washington, the Alara Concept Store in Lagos, the Aishti Foundation Arts and Retail Center in Beirut, a new headquarters building for the International Finance Corporation in Dakar, the new home for the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Center for Art and Culture at Colgate University, and a condominium development for Four Seasons in Washington. And we know he's on at least a couple of really important projects right now in the competition with a few people. Adjaye garnered many honors and awards for his work, including the prestigious Royal Institute of British Architects, Bronze Medal for Architectural Students, and the Design Miami Designer of the Year Award in 2011. In June 2007, he was appointed OBE, Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for services to architecture. Adjaye recently collaborated with Okwi Envezor on the design of the 56th Venice Art Biennial, which is last year's Art Biennial, and his own comprehensive retrospective exhibition was held at Haus der Kunst in Munich, and then traveled to Art Institute of Chicago, where it just closed in January. Jeffrey Schnapp is professor of Romance languages and literature and comparative literature, and on the teaching faculty in the Department of Architecture at Harvard's GSD. He is the founding faculty director of, he's a founder and faculty director of Meta Lab at Harvard and faculty co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. A cultural historian with research interests extending from Roman antiquity to the present, his most recent books are The Library Beyond the Book, co-written with Matthew Battles. There may be others, but this, I augmented something here. The Electric Information Age Book, a collaboration with the designer Adam Michaels. Italia America 2, co-edited with Emanuela Scarpellini, and Digital Humanities, co-written with a team of colleagues. His pioneering work in the domains of digital humanities and digitally augmented approaches to cultural programming includes curatorial collaborations with the Triennale di Milano, the Cantor Center for the Visual Arts, the Wolfsonian FIU, and the Canadian Center for Architecture. His Trento Tunnels project was featured in the Italian pavilion of the 2010 Venice Biennale and at the Maxi in Rome. Nader Tehrani is the Dean of the Irvin C. Channon School of Architecture at the Cooper Union. He is also a principal of NADA, a practice dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and an intensive dialogue with the construction industry. Tehrani has taught at the MIT School of Architecture, so welcome back, where he served as the head of the department from 2010 to 2014. He has also taught at Harvard Graduate School of Design, Rhode Island School of Design, the Georgia Institute of Technology as the Thomas Ventulet Distinguished Chair in Architectural Design, and at University of Toronto, where he held the Frank Gehry International Visiting Chair. As the principal and founder of Office DA, so the first incarnation of the office, Tehrani's work has been recognized with notable awards, including the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award, the United States Artists Fellowship in Architecture and Design, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture. He has also received the Halston Parker Award for the Northeastern University Interfaith Spiritual Center and the Hobson Award for the Georgia Institute of Technology Hinman Research Building. Throughout his career, Tehrani has received 16 Progressive Architecture Awards, as well as numerous AIA Boston Society of Architects ID Awards. And in 2013, 2014, and 2015, NADA was ranked #1 in design for Architect Magazine's top 50 firms in the United States. And though it wasn't listed in this bio, which was deemed provided by the speaker probably at some point to cast, NADA received numerous awards in the last 2 years for its Melbourne School of Design, completed in 2014. All right, are you with me? I'm getting Ginny Cooper recently retired from the District of Columbia Public Library, where she served as chief librarian for 8 years, a period during which she was directly responsible for renovating or rebuilding 14 branch libraries. Among these are both 2 libraries designed by David Adje, as well as renovation of Mies-designed Central Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. Cooper was awarded the 2013 Thomas Jefferson Award for Public Architecture from the American Institute of Architects. A librarian since 1970, Cooper worked in libraries in 5 states, I was going to say 50 states, 5 states, sorry. 5 states and in New York City as executive director of the Brooklyn Public Library. Okay, you see, I'm really losing it now. She is a past president of the Public Library Association, a division of the American Library Association, and a recipient of the Charlie Robinson Award, made by the Public Library Association to recognize a public library director who has been a risk taker, an innovator, and an agent for change. Chris Borg, finally, is director of the MIT Libraries. She arrived to MIT in February 2015. Prior to MIT, she served in a variety of leadership positions at Stanford University, where she managed the public service facets of physical and digital library services of the largest division of the Stanford University Libraries, with 6 branches and a collection of more than 4 million volumes. Borg's career began with 10 years of service as an officer in the United States Army, including 3 years on the faculty of the United States Military Academy at West Point, where she taught sociology and leadership. She has written and spoken extensively on the topics of libraries, leadership, diversity, and social justice. She is a strong advocate for gender equality and was involved in creating and leading the first Women's Voices and Influence group for Stanford staff. All right, so with that, we have a kind of order. I hope that didn't, put you all to sleep. And it begins with David Adjaye. So I think the way we're going to run this is that every one of you comes here and presents the 10-minute presentations or responses, and then we're going to sit down and dive into, magic.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you. It's nice to be here, to be part of this incredible award, and to be talking to you about the libraries, which are a very important space to have a debate about in terms of our civic and public life. I have 10 minutes. I have too many slides, but I'm just going to really, so I'm going to try to keep it in 10 minutes. But I wanted to show you the images. I'm not going to talk extensively about everything, but to really talk about the investigation since 2000 to this time that we've been doing into the nature of the library, and to summarize that, essentially what has become a key driver is this notion of placemaking, that the library moves from just being a depository of public knowledge as the internet dissolves that archive and becomes a place of socializing to gain knowledge, a network place and a place to reimagine different parts of the city and how it contributes to our public and civic life. I'm going to show 4 examples in different parts of the world, and hopefully that will stimulate a sort of a discussion. The first one is in Gwangju, and probably the most unusual. Gwangju has an incredible, incredibly high levels of literacy, an extraordinary place where there's a biennial, and we were invited to create a pavilion in that biennial. I worked with a writer, Tai Selassie, and we imagined the idea of a library as a public piece of infrastructure. A library is a public staircase that leads from the street to the river. This is a kind of quick context image, but essentially we conceived this idea that in this incredible culture that really has an incredible dynamic of literature and reading, that we would dissolve the notion of a building into just a place that could activate engagement. It would be, Wi-Fi'd and able to kind of deal with all the kind of internet issues, but also it would be a place that would somehow be able to archive and store information and be a place to trade and share information. And at the same time also just be a structure that would go up and down to the water and beyond. So a kind of a big experiment. It's been incredibly successful. We were surprised. The building was designed so that it basically floods when the high floods come, and it's in 2 parts. It's sort of at this river edge, and we'll quickly go through it. So it's a concrete and timber structure. The base is this sort of infrastructure of stairs, which also have bookshelves indented into it. It's cast concrete and sealed. And the upper level is this timber porous sunshade, which creates this sort of monument. This is the timber structure, and then this is the form. Second was the idea of a library in a local community in London. And the idea was in a very diverse part of London, which historically has always had huge diversity, about 15 different languages spoken formally in this neighborhood. We were to make a new kind of library infrastructure system that would essentially try to bring information to this community and serve as a support network for the diversity of different groups and age groups that would use this infrastructure. We sought to basically seek to make a library like a textile, a kind of network of systems that would connect together, sometimes literal and sometimes metaphorical, and to create a building which essentially was a podium, a sort of an extrusion of the street with a series of services in it. It would combine lifelong learning. It has a creche. It has dance spaces, spaces for learning about body and wellness, outdoor spaces, cafes, and all the various parts of a traditional library that you know, media, computer studies, language labs, etc. So it became really a building which has this central core in which all the activity happens. It has a kind of double stair which takes you up and down. And you have a series of plates that are basically set up to deliver these services and to dissolve the notion of the library into a perimeter system of services that are sort of in this sort of main space, but then a series of window moments which allow the user to basically turn away from the building and, as it were, engage with their environment. So there is no reading room. The reading positions are all on the perimeter system, and then the sort of stacks and systems or teaching spaces are inside the form. It was also the first time that we built what would be a kind of platinum LEED building for a library where there are no ducts. It works with pressurized floors and sort of mass concrete moment structure, which was at that time a big change. So to be highly environmentally conscious and to also kind of rethink the services and infrastructure of this type. It had this overhanging structure that overhang the streets and had escalators that bring you directly off the street, multi-porous system, no single entry. And the escalator would bring you up to the quieter spaces. The ground floor was more children's library, media, etc. The canopy was basically a device to trap heat gain. Those of you who know about architecture, heat gain, and to kind of create an exhaust, a climate moderator on the facade, which would also work as a kind of new kind of porch to position the building in its public realm. We were allowed by the city to make this building jut out away from the sort of building line because of this statement about a new public porch, a new piece of infrastructure, a new modern way of kind of creating the public porch, which would then bring you up into this building and deliver the various services to you. It very much welds with the street, which is a market street, and it's a 7-day market, so it's always there. And then the south-facing chamber becomes this moment where, with the sort of colored glass, you get these effects. This is that chamber, that climate moderator that people go up and down and releases heat at the top and allows the building to stay cool on its interior. This is a kind of image of the interior with the exposed slabs and the way in which the spaces unfold. Dance spaces, sort of spaces with vignettes. We dissolved the notion of the book stacks and turned them into what we called a landscape, which allowed people to kind of surf in different ways, connections between floors, and then the rooftop, a cafe with retractable skylights that creates an outdoor courtyard on the roof, and gave the citizen a new vantage point to see their community, really. And then these are two libraries that I'm going to just quickly show you and end with in Washington that I work with Ginny Cooper on, and they are two libraries in two communities in southeast and southwest of DC, in Anacostia and a close neighbor. And in a way, they were in communities, one not so depressed, but another that was a low-income community. And it was about trying to imagine this infrastructure that would create a sense of social pride in the sort of socializing of knowledge sharing, and create a building that would deliver new services to these communities, which would help to empower the generations in the community in their aspirations and in their life, in a sense. So it's really, how does a building that is a new piece of infrastructure, which is not just a kind of utilitarian box, but something which sets up something very specific, engage with these very diverse suburban-like communities, and to create a kind of connection to this bigger idea of what the library can offer. So this is just an image of the team and some of the libraries that were all done, where two of us are in there. These are just giving you images of the community. This is Francis Gregory, which is next to a park. Some of the reference images, this idea of a kind of a new public space. This building was set up as a kind of, almost as the idea of the public room that connects to the landscape. Its upper levels had sort of meeting and community rooms. Children's library was brought upstairs. And so you have this volume. Within this volume, the skin of the building is modulated so that it expands and contracts depending on the orientation. The elevation looks like diamonds that are all the same size, but they are all contracting and expanding to do with this notion of this growth form. And the building is actually 40% insulated. It's a highly sustainable building, but it presents the perception of what glass is as a kind of dichotomy. As you sort of turn around the corner, you see it in different lights, and as you come to it, you see it in different ways. It has a porous sort of surface around it to do with stormwater management, etc. And as you kind of move around it, what you think is thin becomes thick, and as you move into it, you see that you're in this wooded pavilion of these sort of dilating diamonds that are sort of bathed in light, and creates this room that becomes a series of lenses to the forest and to the community, and becomes a room where teaching, learning, and activities are happening, and stacks are also in the space. There are kind of enclosed chambers of different forms, using thick glass and thin glass, etc. Moments where the form releases and becomes very vertical, vertiginous, and sort of dissolves. And then children's library and community spaces. The building, sort of in its context, disappearing in the winter and the summer. And then the second, in a different community, a sort of Bellevue, which has a kind of topography that's fascinating, because it's a sort of series of hills with a sort of very typical house builder, sort of architecture of detached homes, but very fascinating sort of devices of these stilts that sort of negotiate these landscapes. And I sort of became very fascinated by that. And so this is the institution here, surrounded by these houses. We sought to kind of make a form which had a kind of an agglomerating character, a series of smaller forms, and then a larger body. The smaller forms would start to create these very special rooms which would frame the city, the community in different ways, giving you vantage points to it, but also would create elevations to explore, and to kind of have a place that would be a way for the community to sort of rethink their own environment, but also kind of see it as a kind of center where they would come together. On the ground plane, volumes were elevated to create a plaza where car boot events could happen. Students would meet under, this is south facing, so would meet under these volumes, creating a sort of informal sort of teaching, arrival, gathering space, community space for the community. The library you would come into would offer sort of digital and sort of popular services on the ground floor, and then you would rise up the building, service core here, into different spaces and stacks, children's library on this floor, and then sort of rise again up to a space where you would have other stacks and sort of arrive on the final floor where you'll be able to enter these chambers. So this children's library has a kind of small sleeping pod for children, which sort of looks over its sort of sleeping storytelling pod that would sort of be specific. So this is the building in its section. So it's really a kind of spiral to this view, the building in its context, the arrival. Great, thanks. Ten minutes. Thank you.
Great. Let's see. My slides are invisible then. What I'm going to contribute to this discussion, I hope will nicely dovetail with the presentation David has made here. And I'm giving you the what is basically a kind of 10-minute recipe version of what could be an hour-long discussion about what is the mix of elements, programmatic, mission-based, the fine-grained and macro considerations that, in my view, ought to be points of reference in a conversation about the future of libraries. Like every recipe, this is one where an expert chef knows the importance of ingredients, but also the freedom that exists to combine and recombine in ways that make sense. And that making sense process for me is all about something that I think is exquisitely present in David Adjaye's work, which is an intense sensitivity to what it is that place and space do in a given place, the way in which they can serve as catalysts, the way in which they resonate with the history, with the context, with the entire environment within which a library performs its function. So what I'm going to do here in this kind of short, the 10-minute version is just walk through a couple of elements that seem to me interesting pieces of the larger puzzle of answering the question of what a library could be or should be in the 21st century. So I'm going to start with some things that I don't think it should be or could be plausibly in the 21st century. If you ask people at the turn of the 19th century, entering the 19th century, and then at the end of the beginning of the 20th century, what a library is, and indeed, this is an image that continues to haunt our imagination when we think of answering the question of what is a library, the answer was an industrial era storage system for books. And much of the history of late 19th century libraries and many of the legacy libraries of today allocate an enormous percentage of their interior space to this storage function. Indeed, that storage function was viewed as a kind of sublime advance in the history of the library as an institution. People stood outside of New York Public as the stack structure was the Sneed, steel stacks were being built and looked at them with the same admiration that they looked at the building of skyscrapers in the same era. And I do not think we are in that era anymore. So one of the exciting questions we must confront as a community of people who are thinking creatively and actively about the nature of knowledge spaces is what are all the great, cool things we can do with a lot of that space that was dedicated before to mere storage? The second ingredient that I don't think we need to think about is what I think of as the consummate dumb space of the contemporary world, which are computer workspaces. They look little more like, they barely differentiate themselves from sort of tobacco, places where people were rolling cigars, or I think we can do more creative and interesting things with a world where the database has become one of the defining features of the world of knowledge sharing, exchange, production, and so forth. And one of the things, of course, that the database does, and its ubiquity does, the fact that it can be accessed through devices that fit in my pocket or that ride in my briefcase, is to raise, I think, really powerful and rich and important questions about where the library begins and ends, and what it is that a place and space can do that the database cannot. Databases are not places, and the knowledge that they convey means something or is of trivial importance in relation to the places where that knowledge is activated. And I think the question about what a library could or should be today is a question about how databases intersect local places and realities and stories. So with these two excluded ingredients, I want to turn to a set of possible ingredients that we could think of. And I already anticipated my number one point, which is thinking creatively about storage. And that can mean a number of different things. It can, of course, it isn't an invitation to abandon the storage function of libraries. I think that storage function remains vital, but we can be selective. We can adopt a qualitative approach to the idea of what are the assets whose physicality is a core feature of the experience of a knowledge space like a library, and what kind of things do we want those collections to do in relation to the communities that animate and activate a space. And of course, the answer is going to be very different in a research library and in a local branch public library because of the nature of the kind of activation processes we're talking about. Number two, documents, of course, are migrating into digital environments and formats, but we are printing and producing more print artifacts than ever in the history of printing as a technology today. And so we have this whole world of hybrid media, which has, by the way, always been the world of the library, but in a new form, in a new configuration. So how do we create spaces that allow us to work across those kinds of platforms in the way that people actually read, think, exchange, share today? That's a core question. Within that question is a question of where we add value to through the design of the physical spaces that are under discussion. The second question I want to talk about is special collections. I think as part of the answer to the question of what do we do with all that cool of space that we're no longer going to lock down in the form of storage, of shelving systems and so forth, one of the things we can think about are what are those collections and sets of objects that truly speak of the place where they are located, that tell stories about the nature of the institution, about collecting practices, about the communities that inhabit a given location. And so I think the privilege, the role of special collections, collections that typically cut across categories also, from the world of objects, the world of documents and books, to every kind of conceivable form of documentation of a process or a practice. Those kinds of categories of collections seem to me to offer special opportunities. They tend to be buried. They tend to be hard to get at. If we can bring them out into spaces where they're open to interaction, I think we're beginning to explore this world of possibility that moving away from a storage-based understanding of the library, we're able to do. The next question I want to turn to is to connections. That kind of storage answer to the question of what is a library, of course, tended to emphasize collections as the centerpiece of the mission, of the identity of libraries. And of course, collections are fundamental to what libraries are, who they serve, their histories, and so forth. But the collections were always the basis for connections. And I think orienting our gaze towards the question of who we serve, how we serve them, how we construct that spatial platform as a platform that makes connections, that serves as a catalyst for connections, is an essential part of this rethinking process. I've already anticipated, in a sense, with respect to special collections, I think I see one of the opportunities that we have in this rethinking and redesign process to really think about some of those kinds of forms of selection and partitioning and specialization that gave rise to separate institutions, the museum, the archive, the library, different kinds of museums, archives, and libraries. There are good reasons for those separations, but there are also effects that those separations have that are in tension with processes of discovery and knowledge sharing. And I think that one of the opportunities we have, again, thinking about all this space that we can now recurate and redesign, is thinking about how we create conversations across media types, across different categories of objects, how we treat them, curate them, tell stories with them, interpret them in dialogue with one another, rather than separating paper documents from three-dimensional objects, from artworks, and so on down the line. I think the opportunity to think about what a library is in terms of the categories of objects that are on the shelves, the proliferation of maker spaces in libraries today, which is a gesture in this direction, suggests that maybe tools that allow us to learn, to tell stories, to make arguments ought to be on the shelves alongside books. That the kind of bookishness of the storage-based model needs to be expanded to encompass other kinds of forms of learning and knowledge that involve the hand and not just the mind. This was a concept that was come up with in a design studio that I was involved in the GSD, and my team at MetaLab has been leading for a couple of years. The notion of cold spots. I'm sure all of you can remember the moment when you used to walk around with your mobile devices hunting for hotspots, because hotspot was like an oasis in the desert. You were out seeking those 3 bars where you knew that you actually had access to the world. Well, we now live in a world of ubiquitous hotspot. The world has become a hotspot. And the library has this special role as serving as a kind of platform of connection, but also of disconnection. How do we want to design forms of disconnection? It's a different way of framing the question of the kind of ways in which libraries have always served as places of refuge, as places of contemplative remove from the everyday, and yet of engagement, of re-engagement from that perspective of contemplative engagement. So I think the question of how we design hotspots, how the levels of disconnection that we want buildings, in a sense, to create, enforce, to open up, I think is a really rich possibility not to be underestimated. I've already anticipated this question of moving between the hand and the mind, thinking about the notion of tools as part of the set of assets, learning assets that libraries make available. So I'm not going to dwell on that. I think that the notion of librarians themselves, but also the communities that animate libraries as being engaged in somehow a kind of expanded sense of curatorial practices where we use the objects, whether they're documents or they are collections of objects, to tell stories, to share, to expose processes of learning as they're happening, to solve community problems. I think those are all opportunity spaces to really think about curatorial practice, the curation of knowledge and culture as one of the activities that we want to physically facilitate through the design of spaces. And I think particularly the redesign, the reuse, kind of the détournement of stack structures to use as exhibition spaces strikes me as an interesting hypothesis. I like that idea. And that's what we like to call in our group, programmable stacks. Imagine that stacks, we no longer, because we have information systems and we have databases, we no longer need to worry about books being in a universal order. What if we can constantly reshuffle them like a deck of cards to tell different kinds of stories? This is something that is available to us as an option. Last but not least, I want to emphasize the importance of process, of libraries as places where we see learning taking place in a kind of social setting, where one of the things that the space and the place do is really to create these forms of visibility about processes that otherwise pass unnoticed. I think this is particularly important in environments like universities, where there's so many amazing things always happening, but it is so difficult to actually be aware of them, to see them, to experience them. I think the library has an opportunity to be that place. And so just to conclude, I want to come back to this notion of the library as an institution whose fundamental objective is really to be a hybrid, not to be a single thing, not to be the place where knowledge or information is stored, but rather a place that's a hub, that's a platform, a lab, a showcase, a switchboard, somewhere you make connections, but above all, a place that somehow has deep roots and intersects deeply with all of the dynamics that would grant meaning and activate the potential for a physical structure to serve as a catalyst within a community of learning. Thank you.
Thank you. That was, if I can appropriate your introduction, I'll go right into mine, because there's so many themes that you bring up that are quite resonant with the 3 case studies that I'll try to elaborate on. I was part of an MIT focus group on the future of the spaces of learning. And the question of what is the function of the campus going to become once there are all these online courses? Why, if you can educate 50,000 people, would 10,000 people come here? And of course, we've lived through that theme over hundreds of years with the notion of the book, Killing Architecture or the Building. And yet we know that certain things persist over time, and there are good reasons for that. We live in a time where the space of learning or the space of reading or the library is at once on our couch at home, it's by the sea, it's on the train home. So we understand the ubiquity of our ability to tap into the world. At the same time, the way that we blend low culture, high culture, personal space and public space has formed us in quite different ways. We no longer have to wait for Thursday to watch that series. We can download them at will. And so one of the big questions that MIT asked us was, why is the curriculum bundled in such a way when you can just take somebody else's bike or somebody else's car? So the whole notion of debundling as a conceptual idea became a central theme to begin to think of how many other ways are there to learn. You learn by interning, you learn by researching, you learn by extending your education to 7 years or compressing it to 3 years. Nobody said that 4 years is the right amount. We also know that place matters. There is something about the aura, the sense of a place, that is not replaceable, and that's what makes UVA different than MIT. And somehow we come to learn those things. At an organizational level, we looked quickly at all sorts of teaching spaces, learning spaces, top-down learning and the ideological implications that come with that. The whole notion of the Harkness and the idea that you're learning on a flat playing field. The hierarchies are broken down. Spaces of the teal that we have right here, where you're at once connected to the world, but connected to each other in a space of collaboration. Our own Gershenfeld, and the idea that learning is done in a laboratory with many different devices concurrent with each other. Or, the space of debate, as it were. And yet, somehow, the space of architecture is not yet defined. And we know the presence, the aura that has. Think, if you will, about our own library here. Some years ago, it was this dark and somehow dingy space. But with the opening of the Oculus, that is the one thing that opened up this pantheon to become yet a place again. So the importance of architecture, and I'm being opportunistic here, of course, is that it is central, in fact, to the cultivation of a campus, and in this case, the cultivation of a library. The 2 case studies I'll present to you very quickly are the University of Melbourne, the Melbourne School of Design, and I'll end with the RISD Library. In the context of the Melbourne Uni, the building of a new school of architecture and design planning became the opportunity to break down the traditional boundaries between what we call or what we think of design and the other disciplines on campus. Engineering over there, anthropology over there. And so the notion of the ground plane being opened up and extending the public into the building, essentially giving over the entire base to the entire campus, was something that was vital to making this the new center of the university. At the same time, the idea of creating a new street that ran through there enabled the possibility to create a triad between the library, or the traditional library, broken down, dissolved, the Fab Lab, which is just right above there, the space of making, and the exhibition space. Here, Tom Cavan, the dean of the school, had this idea that places of research, places of thinking need to find a way to externalize that through the act of making. And making is a form of knowledge. You're producing a form of knowledge. But what if you produce a form of knowledge and have no way to communicate it to a broader public? And the exhibit space becomes that opportunity. So the building becomes a spatialization of this idea of the street that breaks down the barriers between these spaces. These spaces in turn connect to the campus symbolically and literally. And the actions that belong traditionally in this or that space leak out into shared spaces, informal spaces. So spaces of the library in making end up being divided not by function, but by things like noise or smell or privacy or scale. Other kinds of programmatic functions take over. So the library effectively leaks up into the building to the space, in fact, above the exhibition hall. Now, this section of this building is quite important because by building a new piano nobile for the building, we solve, in a way, two problems. A school of design dedicated to about 2,000 designers without any dedicated space for design. So what did that mean? It was a kind of trick to dovetail the spaces of scholarship with the spaces of design in what are called hot spaces. Not hot as in wired, but hot as in schedulable spaces, hot desks. What happens in the morning, what happens in the afternoon, what happens in the evening. So effectively, the library moves up the building and the design moves down the building, effectively embracing each other, and the entire space, what would become the traditional reading room of a library, has now lifted up, gaining natural light, and then the taxonomy of the building is impacted by it. What would have been the traditional corridor is leaking systematically on every floor into different spaces of design, of research, and then different pieces of furniture begin to get associated with the kinds of collaborations that you would do not only in design, but also in the library. Collective works, individual works, drafting, crit spaces, social spaces, all of these come together in a kind of sectional hybrid that identifies the importance of the intricate configuration of the space with the larger symbolic and figural ambitions of identifying the totemic importance of some of these spaces that need to be rightfully enclosed for acoustic reasons. And so we are not shy of what architecture can do in this context, and are rightfully aware of the history that comes with these kinds of gestures. Now, some years before this, a graduate myself of the Rhode Island School of Design, we were asked to look at the Hospital Trust building, the Fleet Bank at that time, and the entire building was being looked at for the new dormitories. What they didn't know was what was going to happen with the banking hall. Carol Terry, who had been already theorizing the future of the library some 30 years ago, had a very clear sense of what this was going to become. And it's really under her tutelage that we even entered into this discussion in any sense. And so the idea that this vast and heavy monolith of dormitories would be riding over the library would mean effectively that this is their living room, this is their lounge, this is their social space. Also, something quite ironic was this idea that Carol brought to us. In the previous library, ironically, the students had no access to books. What did she want to do? She wanted to make a browsing library, to make books accessible once again, knowing fully well that they see everything on their screens, their iPhones and laptops. She wanted a space where the word and the image come together. And that has something to do with the library of a school of art, of the visual arts. Knowing that knowledge is internalized in very different ways. We look at the picture first, then we read the words, and that's how knowledge begins to happen. That's how you light the fire. Now, in the banking hall, it turns out that what she had in mind was, about double the amount of programs. So it could not have been fulfilled in there, in the existing square footage. So building new structures was a kind of indispensable aspect of being able to pull this project off. And because of purely technical reasons, code reasons, we needed not only to make the mezzanine accessible with a new elevator, but also those spaces that would need to otherwise not be able to fit. The spaces of video watching, spaces of studying that would go on top of that, making them accessible meant that we needed bridges and stairs and things that would ultimately transform this library into something else beyond the living room. The staircase that connects then the main plaza, the central space that brings the campus together, is also its main theater. That theater is the living room of the campus in one sense, but then there are many other types of reading areas, research areas, spaces of collaboration and interaction around it. But just to imagine what happens in this space, in the abstract, over time we came to understand that theater, which was never something significant at RISD, began to have a life of its own on campus. Weddings, music, and of course art, the space of drawing. That this becomes a theater for drawing is an essential part and an extension of the nature lab of the Rhode Island School of Design, so important to its foundation program. So the library is everything but the space of the book, and at the same time, Carol was able to get over 80% of the books, all as the insular wrap around this main public space. I'll end then with this idea of flexibility. On the one hand, the notion of spaces today under huge economic duress need to be absolutely flexible, and you must imagine that they will certainly become something else in 10 years, in 30 years. So the idea of the programmable floor or the programmable ceiling, but free of any definitive program, is important. But also the notion that some notions about flexibility have to do with something that is irreducible. The scale of the individual, the scale of 5 people working together, the dark space, the light space, the acoustic space, and one has to be mindful of those. But above all, the idea that the audience that you're serving is a public, and is a public that extends the field of the urban realm into these buildings and makes them culturally vital. And that was one of the missions that Carol sought to bring into this building, and she did. This is not the RISD library. In fact, it invites the entire city of Providence and beyond to come inside. Thank you.
Hello. I'm very pleased to be with you here this evening. You will not see pretty pictures from me. You've seen pictures of libraries that I had something to do with already. I'm the representative of the public library, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about public libraries. You'll hear many of the same comments and words that you heard from the 3 previous speakers as well. And I promise to close with one of my favorite library stories at the moment when I learn that my time is nearly up. So you can have that to look forward to. Anna gave us a few questions to respond to, and I'm going to do that here as well. First, for those of you who don't know about public libraries, they really are the magic places in the world. They were for me when I was a child. My guess is many of you would have similar stories to tell. Public libraries are funded locally. More than 90%, in some cases as much as 98% of the money is approved by those local people elected to make the hard decisions about where tax money goes on a very local basis. So they're very different from one another, and each very responsive to its own community. At the same time, public libraries are more alike one another than they are different from one another, and that's part of the way that the magic happens. And yes, as you've heard others say, we are not about storage anymore. We are, in fact, about how to make the space that the community needs at that particular time and in that particular place. And our colleagues and partners in doing so are often architects. One of the questions was, what is the role of architecture in determining the future of the library? You know, you saw some of those wonderful images from the previous speakers of what public libraries are. One of the things that happens with a new building or a newly designed space is everybody pays attention in a different way than they did before. You walk in expecting it to be different than it was before because it looks different, and it gives you that as a way of doing it. If architecture did nothing else other than give people that opportunity to change the way they look at something and think of it, it would serve a wonderful purpose for all of us. And in public libraries, that is ever true. In public libraries, in local communities, there are people who have the stories that I said was mine, that the library was the magic place I found out about the world, and many, many other stories. And often there are people who want those libraries to say exactly as they have been, that library of their imagination, of their past as they remember it now. So architecture helps to say there is something a little bit different going on here in that exact way. One of the challenges of public libraries is because we do belong to the public, that means everybody has a say in what it's going to be and has an opportunity to critique what you're going to do with the building that's coming and with the services that are there. It's kind of David Adjaye not to tell the story of the woman in one of the communities that he showed the library of, who stood up at a public meeting and said she had been trying to call England and talk to Prince Charles because she heard he didn't like David's buildings and she didn't like it either. And she wanted to see how that could happen together. True story, yes, David? Right. She's become a fan of the building finally, but really wanted it to be in red brick and just like her house and just like her neighborhood, and was quite sure that what we were talking about wasn't going to fit and wasn't going to work for her in her neighborhood. But in fact, the role that libraries play in local communities is really magic. For many people who are disconnected with the government that is in fact theirs, it is the way that that government says, this is what you are worth. This beautiful building with all of these magic things inside to open up the world to you and the places for you to be, this is yours, and it's your government that has created and provided that for you. It really is a wonderful thing to be involved in. So in fact, architects and librarians are allies as we move forward together in this brave new world of what libraries become. And they are changing. They used to be about collections, as you've heard from others. We are now still about connections in a way that makes sense and helps people find a way to connect with everybody in their community in one way or another, and with that community and that local government very often. That civic engagement is an important role for libraries, and it's something that in public libraries we pay a great deal of attention to. It also becomes increasingly a place for collaboration. You saw that with the RISD Library and the ways, and the Melbourne Project, and the way that different disciplines worked together and were a part of what it is that was being done in that building. And collaborations or collaborating is a big part of what libraries do. And we are moving increasingly into being places for creation. Now, it is usual for people to come to the library to create a report for a group of sixth graders that are going to go to the library's study rooms to work together, or a dance project that somebody wants to create, and the library is a great place to meet a musician you don't know to try to figure out how to make that happen. or to learn how to read. Nothing says, I don't really need literacy training, than walking into a public library, and that's a common place for that to happen too. So now I'm told it's nearly the end of my time, and I get to tell you what is one of my favorite library stories. And I think it talks about what the library can do and does do. A number of years ago, in a library where I used to work, a very, very talented children's librarian came to me with an idea. She was trying to figure out how we could help our community teach children to read when so many start kindergarten behind and stay behind as they move forward. Her great idea became a program that I've used at very nearly every library where I have worked. And in this program, books, usually paperback books, usually ones that are not worth a great deal of money and that we got quite inexpensively, would go to the library, to the classroom, and a volunteer would go to that classroom every 3 weeks. We targeted classrooms where the reading level was not at grade level and where these kids needed to learn the magic of reading and certainly didn't have that sense about this very hard to do thing. So the volunteers, sometimes staff, sometimes volunteers, would go and they would book talk. In the library world, think of it as the previews of coming attractions in movies. It's where you tell enough about the book so that this 8-year-old or 9-year-old or 10-year-old wants to get their hands on that book. And when they're done with the book, they can pass it on to somebody else, bring it back, whatever. We don't care. It's to get them to have that book in their hand and excited about opening that book that is the real point of what you're doing. So one of the people that worked on this program told this story. She told about being in a classroom. It was a 4th grade classroom. And in that classroom, there were 4 languages spoken in addition to English. So she had 3 language interpreters who were interpreting her words for the 4th graders in that class that were transitioning to English. And at the end of her program, as often happens when you do that kind of presentation, all the kids rushed up and wanted to tell her things. You know, I love that book about the dog. You know, I love dogs. My cousin has a dog. You know, all of that kind of chatter. And during all of this time, there was a little boy who was standing right beside her. He didn't say anything. And after all the kids had had their say, Kathy leaned over and she said, "Did you have something you wanted to say?" And he put his hand in his pocket and he reached out his hand and in it was his library card. And he said, "I American now." Now he wasn't, of course, but he was in all the ways that are wonderful. And whatever the library has in the future, I know that that will continue to be an ingredient of it. Thank you.
So I'm not sure how I'm supposed to follow that story, but I'm going to try. When I first thought about what I wanted to say tonight, I wanted to talk about what a remarkable time it is to be a librarian. And it really is. I mean, we can take nothing for granted right now in libraries. And that's kind of remarkable. The challenge in trying to understand what a library as a space would look like, should do when, as Jeffrey says, we can carry much of human knowledge in our pocket, that's a really cool challenge. And so, I feel a great privilege to be in this profession right now. That's really cool. But at 10:30 this morning, I had an experience. I have this experience a lot in the year I've been here, but I had this experience where it felt like a really remarkable time to be at MIT. Right, so for those of you who didn't hear the news, at 10:30 this morning, MIT announced that a group of scientists from MIT, along with the collaborators from Caltech, detected for the first time gravitational waves, which I don't really understand what they are, but I understand. But what I know is that they are ripples in the time-space continuum that were predicted by Einstein in 1916. And at the time, he predicted that we'd never be able to really see them or detect them. And after years and years and many, many collaborators, we detected them. And in the article about that, one of the scientists on the team talked about it being a very visceral experience, that they could actually hear this moment when two black holes merged together and collided to create another black hole, a whoop. And so there's something there, right, about a sensory experience that in this thing that is a kind of science that is, for those of us who are not scientists, sort of beyond our comprehension, that is still very visceral and sensory. And I think there's some themes there to be played with around library as space and around the question that Jeffrey raises about sort of what do we do with this space that we can free up with collections? And I think the question before that is, well, which collections should we keep and why? And maybe they're the ones where they help us have these sensory experiences. There's a couple of other library pieces to this gravitational pulls waves story, which I'm still fascinated by. One of the things that was really wonderful about it is I think we all at MIT, or everyone I ran into today at MIT, felt like they were a part of it. Right? I walked a little taller today. I feel proud. I mean, I had nothing to do with this. I had never even heard, but I feel pretty darn good to be at MIT today. It's that connection. I feel connected to research that happened here because I'm here, because I'm part of this community. And I think, again, libraries can facilitate that, can enhance that. Another interesting library part of that story is that within about 20 minutes of the announcement that came out, the website that hosts the article that describes the research behind this was having some connection problems, right? But people wanted to read the research, and they were, thousands of people were hitting that website, the physical review letters of the American Physics Society, and there were some connection problems. Okay, what's really cool about that is librarians at MIT were scrambling to try and figure out how to make sure that folks here could still have access to that research. And literally, as I'm speaking, some of the rock star librarians that work here and the staff and the archivists who work here at the MIT libraries are curating a collection of articles that are the foundational research that led up to this huge breakthrough in science. They're curating a collection of articles that are available in DSpace, which is our open access repository. So these will be articles that are open to the world to read. This is our way of saying we do this stuff at MIT and we're sharing it. Who is our community? Our community is anyone who wants to understand this amazing breakthrough that happened here at MIT today, right? We have a big community and we're connected and we want to be that place, whether it's digitally or physically, we want to be that place of connection to each other and to science and to learning and to possibility. Last night, David, we've talked about magic here. So we've talked about connection, we've talked about magic. And last night, David said something about how and I hope I get this right, he said that he sees part of his job as to sort of cast a spell with the work that he does to make people think something is important, right? And I want to extend that. It just was such a lovely way of talking about how space can do that, how places and physicality can do that, can communicate that. For me, what I want libraries to do that, the spaces to do that. I also want them to communicate and to be places where people know that they are important and that they belong here. I want the libraries to be that space where the students and the community can feel that those riches and that the science that happens here, the learning that happens here, the riches, that they are a part of that, the way that I felt a part of the announcement this morning. I want the libraries to be that space where it communicates to the community all of the science that's happening today, all that has happened previously, here and elsewhere, that they have access to it, that they're a part of it. Similar to the experience that the young child described, I'm American now. In a research library, I'm a scholar now. I'm a scholar now, and I get to be in this place. And we used to feel that, I think. I told a story last night, and I'll tell it again today. I'm a first-generation college student, so when I walked into the library at Duke University, to Perkins Library too many years ago for the first time, to see those books, to see those stacks of books, and to feel like, I get to read these. These are for me too now. That's an amazing experience. And is it just books that can do that? I think not. I think it could be really interesting, and is really interesting, to think about libraries as spaces, digital, physical spaces, cultural spaces, metaphorical spaces, where people feel that they belong in the scholarly conversation. And that's what I hope we'll be able to do here at MIT, what I know we'll be able to do here at MIT. So thanks very much.
I'm gonna sit sort of. Want to sit next to me?
Which one is mine?
I was gonna sit here, but maybe I'll just sit at the very edge because.
Do you want a water? I was told I'm not to. In this seating.
I see.
Thank you. Water.
We on? We're on. All right, well, that was awesome. I think we covered magic. I was going to open with magic, but I really do feel like there's enough ways that we've entered the topic already, and maybe the way in which architecture serves it will come back. I will sort of ensure that to some extent. So maybe let's go to the next big topic, future. I mean, obviously, you've also all addressed that to some extent, and maybe we're going to be repeating some of the things, but maybe slightly differently formulated or in conversation now. And it's it's a key topic tonight. It's on our poster, and David Adjaye will participate in every event that he will participate this semester with us. Future will be on the table. And in a way, MIT has copyrighted the word, but it's also always on architects' mind, and it's in a way part of the job description of the design process. So even when one thinks about historical continuum as an architect, they are really kind of thinking in the prospective mode, right? But if we can begin to sort of pry it open and slice it. I actually want to go to something that Jeffrey Schnapp didn't say today, but has said in his work on the library after the book, in a way. And I'll paraphrase. He said something that if in the past the library's main task was to respond to society's scarcity of information, its contemporary mandate is to deal with its opposite, the abundance of information. And then from the other angle, David Adjaye has said that, in a way, and not talking about the library specifically, that we need a new interpretation of civicness, and that on top of, in architectural terms, on top of maybe needing to edify, we need that civicness to also be kind of a production of a hybrid space with multiple signals, multiple entries, multiple cultural references, and a kind of a heterogeneity of meaning. And so it seems like future is more and more hybrid. And so I'm sort of offering that to you collectively to enter from various angles.
Well, maybe one starting point, just to embroider a little bit further on this question of managing the overabundance of information, which, by the way, as my colleague Anne Blair has shown in some of her work, and was a problem that was acutely felt very early in the history of printing. I mean, in the 16th century, people were in an absolute panic about the overabundance of print matter. Imagine how they would have felt today. They didn't even have even an nth percentage of even the redundancy of information channels that we have today. But I think at every moment of that challenge, one of the things that keeps shifting and that's really rich, and I think it's a real sort of, to come back to your question about future, of what's emerging as a new set of challenges, there's a different kind of cognitive sort of style that characterizes these shifts in media and information and ways of interacting with them and so forth. And I think designing spaces for what is, we're still at the beginning of the digital revolution. I mean, it's hard to remember that when we have this sense of being kind of overwhelmed with all the transformations. But those transformations have barely gelled into new knowledge forms, into new cultural forms, into new social forms. And so I think it is an incredibly challenging task. But what we do see is a new kind of hybridity where things are being realigned, and the privilege that certain forms once enjoyed, like the print record, those privileges are, no longer exist in that same kind of stable relationship to other forms, other channels, and so forth. And for me, what's really, Chris, I love to sort of beat up on like computer workrooms, because they seem to me not only a really dumb space, but they really crystallize the central problem, which is weaving together information and space in ways that add value rather than simply being functional, sort of post-factum legacy solutions. And there aren't really, we talk a lot about smart spaces, and libraries, if there was ever an institution that's associated with the notion of smart space, it's the library. But we really don't have good answers when it comes to the way, for example, electronic media intersect with these other cognitive acts that are so central to our experience, the way we share knowledge, the way we perform knowledge. And I think it's really an exciting frontier to be at, even if it's a challenging one.
Do you want to take on the civic?
Yeah.
Or maybe, the way in which you summon public or represented in the building? Either or, I think one is more active than the other.
Yeah, no, I think this dissolve that technology offers to that sort of idea that we understand of it as this kind of repository of shelving system storage that's kind of open storage that's on display that we've so enjoyed and sort of romance about, and that removal from architecture of that kind of primary idea of the sort of stack and the reading room, which became the kind of two sort of tropes.
I'm going to defend it in a second, but yeah.
I love it. And I think that they are the two archetypes in the system, with that sort of, with a certain sort of redundancy in that sort of, that as the kind of primary agency in its public. I think in a research library, it's a very different thing. When we're talking about a public library in a community, it becomes something else. Because in a way, the hybridity and the civic quality that we're discussing in a public library becomes about a way in which our societies are modernizing and densifying, and the way in which the library becomes a kind of a device which becomes a kind of respite or an agglomerating set of activities that start to make sense to the modernity that's happening around us, should I say that. So in a way, the public library has sort of become a kind of space that is starting to kind of take on board these, not just, I would say, mind issues, but also body issues. So it's oscillating between mind and body as a kind of a space that is serving communities specifically, away from the commercial agents, the commercial sort of activities of commercial space. Now, in a research library, it's a very different phenomena. You are talking about a kind of an academic environment. So this idea of the stack and the romance of the stack and the kind of need to, ritualize the reading room, the place where other great minds have been, is powerful. right? It's your artifact. It's the thing that you want to kind of enjoy, and you want to create a kind of simulation of that continually. So, but the question then is, for me, the moment when that sort of that idea becomes Disneyfied and just becomes a caricature of itself as a way to stage the notion of the environment, where the authenticity is no longer real, but as a kind of device to set it up. And then I question it.
Hybridity as an image, as opposed to
Hybridity is a reality.
right. So this is what so in a way for me there was the problem of the library or its future as it's bracketed by these two notions. On one end, the kind of amassing and hybridization of the media in which knowledge is produced, and on the other, the actual hybridity of and the need for different kinds of references and openings for a kind of public that is no longer a monolithic public.
Yeah.
Seems like an
Correct.
interesting question. I mean, that I think you sort of take on differently. Do you have a...
Yeah, listen, for me, it's an exciting time, if only because all of these discussions trigger an understanding of the discipline of architecture, which can be less apologetic than it was maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And so
I think that's shared at this table.
So the idea that you can produce a form of, not only a form of knowledge, but a form of consciousness through making a subject through the public. And so for me, if you acknowledge that the civic or the public isn't monolithic, the language that you speak through it, the way you materialize things, the way you spatialize things, the way that you organize them is all part of that process, not so much of mirroring society, but even potentially projecting it in a way that has never been before. So the idea of speculation becomes associated with a positive way of imagining a future, something that we were always having to be quite apologetic about some years ago.
We don't have to talk about this will kill that anymore, but this will spawn that, right? Do you want to talk about your two futures, the zoom in and the zoom out?
Last night when we had the discussion with the library task force, and our challenge was to talk to them about how to plan for the future, I said that I had found it helpful to think about two futures. The first is what you can probably figure out is going to happen. So we can see a little bit ahead, and you're absolutely right, it's not anywhere near the midpoint of this digital revolution. We won't be carrying around things at some time we can probably see. We certainly won't need to plug things in. Maybe we won't even need to charge them if we're really lucky. So we can sort of see that world coming. And so we have to do the immediate planning for exactly what that is. And then what's really fun is to separate from that the really far out wild future that you have no idea of, that what might happen. Dare I give the example I gave last night? I was at a library program where I heard someone say, we'll soon, within a century or two, be at the place where people don't read, where they don't have to understand what words mean, that it'll all be spoken to them, or maybe it's given to them in some other way we can't imagine. You take a pill and you know it all or something.
Terrifies me.
Yeah. But when you think about the fact that there once wasn't reading until there was printing, there was no need for reading. And when you think about my mathematics work with slide rules, do kids know what slide rules are anymore? The world does change and tools change, and maybe that's an amazing one too. So what would a library be then?
So I think what's interesting to me is to think about libraries in terms of, as you said, what's the future that we kind of know is coming? What's the wild, crazy future, right? But also, what's the future we want?
Yes.
Right? What's the future we want for scholarly communication? Right? Do we want, in fact, a scholarly communication system that gets around some of the real brokenness of it now, where one of the biggest breakthroughs of our generation in science is behind a paywall, right? Do we want a more open system where that knowledge is truly available, where we're truly taking advantage of the technology, where that knowledge could be in anyone's pocket? If we want that, then what does that imply for what libraries then do? Because they used to manage scarcity, not just in physical form, but also now we're managing scarcity based on this very broken system of scholarly communication.
I mean, I have a question to the architects on the panel. I mean, I have another one. I really do want to talk about stacks because I'm feeling, as this goes, I'm just like feeling more and more worried about the books. I'm just, and about the politics of removing them. But
You're worried about that? How do you think I feel?
Yeah, well,
Oh my God.
it seems like we're embracing it. So a specific question to the architects, and I think we have here two architects who, though with different emphasis and to a different aesthetic end perhaps, care immensely about the material and tectonic effects of their work. And so my question is, what happens when this aspect of your practice, and we can call it a kind of care for detail, assemblies of materials, the affects of those assemblies, intersect with an architecture of or a program for learning? And here I really think broadly, library, museum, school. How do you sort of see the pressure of those programs and those particular architectures on your own sense of practice and what matters?
Did you go first?
A gentlemanly architect kind of debate. No, I mean, I don't see any contradiction at all, because this is the world that we negotiate, and it's actually the world that we actually find stimulation from. Let's just talk about the stacks, because that's the elephant in the room.
But I think, so for me, this is for me a question about basically architecture itself produces knowledge. And so maybe this is an unfair question because I think there is a right answer, right? but there's, I think there's a kind of, I think there's a pressure on your architectures in those situations to speak more didactically.
But the way that you ask the question suggests as if we are these architects with visions or something like that. As if we don't do research just like you do research.
Oh, no. My question is what's the...
But part of the narrative,
Okay.
what I heard is that those people, like the Carol Terrys, like the 15 focus groups that we had in Melbourne, completely changed the way that we would organize space, situate relationships between people. And not all of that is something you can articulate, obviously, in a forum like this, but that the architecture is not naturally just what it is. It is a struggle to establish that scenography, if I can put it that way. That the staging of these relationships is very much programmatic. And then it finds other ways in which it expresses itself through materials and hierarchies that effectively register to your eye or somebody else's eye the icon or what seems to matter. But I think of ourselves as incredibly nerdy when it comes to starting a project. One thing you have to do is to unlearn. To in a way eradicate your biases, because everything you thought you knew, you probably knew wrong. And so, and every client group or every culture or every geography in a way proves to you that you were wrong in what you thought you know. So
Does anyone want to comment on this? You're like, okay, done with that.
No, I want to talk about stacks.
Jeez, okay, so as a curator myself, I love the idea, and as someone who often, I'd say, designs knowledge, as you would maybe say, as part of my practice, right? I love the idea that we could have a way of thinking in test kitchens, in libraries, or some form of sort of experimental library, or even wherever we might be going, in fact, right now, that would include objects, etc. That would have curated assemblies of knowledge objects, right? And that we could rely on the librarian or some other kind of expert to produce those. But as a researcher who relies on books and all the other types of media, right? I sort of feel this, maybe you'll call it nostalgia, but I feel sort of stressed about the politics of access to books without being patronized to, right? Like there's something about arriving to a book stack and not only feeling the kind of knowledge and being in awe on it, but actually being able to find your way and curate it yourself as a researcher. So then if we get rid of storage, because now it's just storage and not a kind of a political gesture, what do we do? Have
So
we
this-
not, yeah.
So this is where I get into really magical thinking because, and I mean, I love the experience, and I do believe of walking the stacks, and I believe serendipity is real. You know, when people say it doesn't really happen, it's just nostalgia. I've seen it happen. It's real. It's not actually magic. You know, I think it's really powerful, but there are limits to the technology of the book and to the technology of the book stack, right? So when you navigate those stacks, you know, MIT doesn't have every book on your topic, so that act of physically browsing the stacks is incomplete, and some books are checked out, and some of what you need isn't a book, it's a map, it's data, it's images, and so in my wildest imagination, you can wander the stacks in an augmented reality kind of way so that you're having that visceral experience of feeling and being in space with physical books, but you also have access in some way that someone brilliant here at MIT will invent for us to the digital objects that are related to that, and to understanding what other people here at MIT are doing that's related to that topic, so that you can then meet them in physical space somewhere. So, you know, my wildest imagination of the future, and I think it's possible, is that the browsing of the stacks, that we take what really works there and make it better.
Yeah, I totally agree. And a student in Library Test Kitchen a couple of years ago developed a project around an idea that we had been elaborating, which I continue to think is a really cool idea. So what if every book, first of all, books today, the books that sit on our shelves are not like the books that were produced 50 years ago. They are already data objects before they are books. They are a radically different kind of object in many ways than the books they look just like, except they're different. But what if every time you searched for a term in a catalog, the books, whether it was an object or a set of objects, they recognized you when you moved around in a physical space. I mean, that is a world of experience that's not unlike the serendipitous experience, but that's actually not a technological problem. It's a design problem. We could have RFID tags in books that are plugged into networks that reflect the eccentric, peculiar intellectual path followed by a single person. Yeah, and I think thinking about how we design that experience.
You don't find that oppressive?
It could be,
library.
but you know what a library. I think if any institution is going to get it right, I think a library would be that kind of institution that could really explore that world of where the digital and the analog intersect one another in ways that are productive, that are generative.
Also, to some degree, this is already happening when we get that unsolicited email by Pinterest saying,
exactly.
These are the things that you're interested in.
Yeah, and I don't always welcome those, but I think that if they're properly filtered and so forth, we can create those kinds of experiences and design them to be productive experiences. So I'm excited by that idea. And I think thinking about books, you know, our even bookish objects circulate in space, and if the traces of those invisible acts of looking to retrieve knowledge, of putting knowledge forms together were to become more visible, that's an enrichment. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only faculty member who loves to see what graduate students are, the information they're curating at their carrels when they're writing dissertations, because I discover things when I see those. But of course, a lot of that activity now is disappearing into screens, and I can't see that anymore. And that's a loss for the kind of collective understanding of who we are, what we're doing, what people are thinking about. And So that kind of making visible, I think, is one of these kind of core challenges.
Making visible and making those connections visible and knowing who's reading what on my topic, and those are very important things that libraries can do and connections that we can do. But to do so in a way that respects the privacy of the reader, which is, one of these, Jenny, I know you'll back me. I mean, it's just one of those like deeply held librarian
Absolutely,
values, right? I mean,
absolutely.
like you say those sorts of things about, snooping in a graduate student's desk. I'm like, no, you can't do that.
But these are open carols, and and everybody does it.
Oh, well, there. Okay, then.
Do you want to?
So I'm very excited about the idea that the fourth book in the series that I've just read 1, 2, and 3 of will magically come to me.
We'll say
So-
hi.
No, that's how
I'm
I
here.
see your knowing the person operating.
Do you want me to call the time to 7:30? Everyone is happy talking to us. So, I mean, some of my questions got spent, but I did have, just kind of in the conversation. But I wanted to ask you to engage in a kind of a futurological experiment of, this will kill that, and give us a version. Obviously, when Victor Hugo wrote the famous words, there was this was a death pronouncement to architecture against the book, basically saying that architecture's power to articulate, represent, disseminate ideas was going to be replaced by the books, which seemed more permanent and faster. And I'm wondering if we were to produce a statement like that for today, what would be this and that? Or you don't have to use the death, metaphor, but this is where I think we were already sort of going towards. If we were to be birthing something as opposed to euthanizing, what would it be?
Wow.
I mean, I want to believe that the promises of technology, that technology would allow us to unleash the democratic promise of education, that technology could do that. It hasn't been realized yet, but I want to believe that we can, right? And some of that has to do with now we really can't, books are not these sacred things. Knowledge is not only inscribed in limited numbers of books that you have to have, you have to belong to that community to have access to. Now they can, be in your pocket. Can technology really birth that true universal knowledge accessible to all?
You go, David.
I think it's extremely exciting because in a way, I think that the limits of printed matter and of printing and of kind of creating a world where we print for every community, this idea of a kind of stacks of paper so that they can sort of engage, I think reached its zenith and kind of, I think even before the internet sort of put it out, I just think it was just an unsustainable kind of image. It's a kind of rarefied, slightly elitist image, and in a way, I think
Technology potentially similarly that?
yes, and I think that technology is potentially also an elitist image, but we have an opportunity to try now to create the kind of forum that technology can operate in where it doesn't have that sense of elitism. And I think we can now we're at the forefront of birthing the image which should make a kind of new, for me, the library becomes the new public square. It really profoundly becomes less about an object, a palace with rarefied information, and becomes the forum of debate. It's the place where the engagement is happening, the commentary is happening. If you look at what's happening in your school, I mean, this idea that you can publish and comment and debate and receive information and hear somebody doing something and have the rarefied document is magical. And I think more reasonable in terms of a kind of potential future, more sustainable. So I kind of see that as more exciting in the end.
And the future that I want to see and what I want to get rid of is I want the future where just as when you go into a library, you go looking for something that is for you exactly right, and you find it, And I want that to apply to every child in this country and to every person, whatever the limits of their opportunities to learn, that we in libraries find a way to augment that. And that's the future I'd like to see us work to create.
I want to bring the senses back into this because I did that slide with the words and the image, but also the technology is doing very incredible things so that what used to be compartmentalized in terms of those who have hearing impairments or those who cannot see, so all of that is now coming back into a knowledge base that could be acoustic, it could be visual, it could be smell. I'm thinking of, if you remember last year or the year before when Ferran Adria came here, he was not talking about cooking. He was talking about the entire knowledge, the alchemy of what constitutes cooking. And so, and the idea that you would think of a special institute for that is in a way ridiculous when he is already making the library that is everywhere. So how do you make, how do you expand that database to engage directly your senses? I mean, that to me is fascinating.
Yeah, I love all of those responses. And I mean, I think what they suggest is that some of these choices are not mutually exclusive choices, that actually, and the sort of media historian in me, trained as a medievalist, immediately kicks in these conversations in answer to Anna's provocation. Media never go away. So the real questions always have to do with mixing, matching, hierarchies. And we have such a proliferation of channels from a sensory standpoint, you know, as were touched upon. So the question of what a library is and what it does is just undergoing this kind of constant expansion over the course of its modern history, certainly. And the conventions for how we organize the experience of accessing knowledge, I think those are all open for design in a way that they haven't been for a couple of centuries. This sort of legacy system, including its stacks, was the result of a very constructed moment in history of ideas about access, about assembly, and so forth. And I think some of the libraries that really excite me are libraries, much like the one you just mentioned, of materials, of things that take us into a different kind of imaginary space, at least, of what it is to experience or share or communicate.
Well, the image that you showed was more like a cabinet of wonders.
It was,
It was really one of those things.
Exactly. And maybe the Wunderkammer is, we don't want to give up the kind of modes of access and reliability that I think you were implying in your reference to the stack, because that stands for a certain kind of rigor, a certain forms of organization. But I actually think that that's where technology can be really a creative tool for having it both ways. You can have programmable stacks where information is still accessible. Digital objects can exist in multiple places at the same time.
I love that if I'm programming it. Right? But this is precisely as a,
You want to be the programmer.
But for yourself, you are.
should we open it to the audience? There's a lot of you. We could have questions from the audience. There are 2 mics on each side, and if you could come to them, or someone will bring it to you, but let us know if you have questions. Yeah, leaving is also okay. Is there a question? Question's coming.
Oh, okay.
There is a question.
Hey, thank you for coming and speaking with us. My question is that I'm interested in the library as an act, the act of the collection as an act of curation, and that curation is an act of gatekeeping. So I'm interested in how you program in a more open sense of curation, because you can have all the contemporary amenities in the world in a library and still come out with the same forms of knowledge, modes of understanding. So how do you break that model of gatekeeping and open it up to the community and program that into really the very structure of the library?
You want to go first? You want me to?
Why don't you go first, and I'll.
You know, I think you're absolutely right about that. And in a way, we've touched on that at a couple of times here, talking about that crazy idea of Jeffrey's that instead of following the book, you're following the person and what their knowledge source is. In public libraries, we do it in a pretty real and pragmatic way. So for example, if you want a book at most of the libraries where I have been, and we don't own it, we will get it. We might borrow it from somebody. We more likely will buy it if it's available to be bought. We also follow as much as we can, the patterns of individuals and groups within our community and think, what are we getting for them? So for example, if I'm at a library that has a tremendous number of kids under the age of 5, what we'll have in the picture book collection is very different than, you probably have a very small picture book collection here, right? So, you know, it's different in that way.
Some awesome artist books.
So we're not getting to the individual, but we're getting to individuals in that way that I think does it. The fact that it's the public's library means in many ways I hate to use this buzzword, we're crowdsourcing what people are interested in having as programs, in having as part of the collection, in having as what's offered, and really try to be responsive in that way. We don't succeed every time for sure, but we're working at it.
Yeah, I think another bit of what I think you're getting at is that, you know, the act of curation, the act of selecting what's going to be in what is a limited physical space, right, is a political act, right? It is absolutely, you know, people talk about libraries as these great neutral spaces. No. They're not neutral. They've never been neutral, you know, choosing to even, I mean, libraries sort of as an institution are by nature very political. The idea that you know, the public gets to have access, you know, we're going to buy a couple of copies of this book and anyone who wants it can come in and have it. That's pretty downright socialist, really. I mean, right?
Books sit next to each other on the shelves with ideas over which people have shed blood.
Yes.
Right there together.
Yes. And so, and libraries have certainly played this gatekeeper role in many, many ways. And you know, do we still do that to some extent, even though I know, you know, some of my colleagues in libraries say, you know, we're still trying to be gatekeepers even though the fence is gone.
Yeah.
You know, right? Everybody can get to everything, and so we're like standing by this gate when everybody's just going around us to get to everything else. But once they get to those things, some of those information objects are still locked away. Yeah. You still need a passcode of some kind to get to them, you know? And so for me, I don't want to be a gatekeeper. I don't want to be a gatekeeper. I don't want libraries to be gatekeepers at all. I want libraries to be these spaces that invite everyone in to partake of the knowledge. And you know, one of the ways that some folks in research libraries are talking about sort of flipping the collection is, you know, what research libraries have done historically, you know, on college campuses, is we've gone out and collected all the books that we think the students and the faculty at our campus want. We've put them in buildings, and we've let you come in and get stuff that other people have written and research that other people have done, and you can have access to it. And then you write your stuff, and you know, you publish it somewhere, and those other libraries get copies of that, right? And so what we're talking about now is sort of turning the libraries inside out. So it's not just, the libraries aren't just for bringing in research from outside of MIT so that people at MIT can consume it, but it's actually using the libraries to push the research of MIT out to the world. So to flip it out so that we're not a gatekeeper, we're actually, I don't know what the metaphor is, but we're throwing our research out there to everyone. That's what I hope we will become, and that technology and buildings, right? I mean, there's a way to signal that with architecture. That I think could be really cool.
A point and then a question I was hoping you could comment on. Well, the first we probably heard a lot, but the book as an object is a pretty exquisite thing. So it'd be sad to lose that. I don't think the screen is a very good replacement. And the part about the stacks is not necessarily the stack as a physical object, but the serendipity of the stack. So whenever I'm doing research and I'm in the library and I'm looking at this shelf, I'll often notice like a few shelves down, there's slightly different version of the topic I'm looking at that's really important that I didn't know about. And so that experience, I think, is important. It'd be sad to lose. But maybe the more interesting question is this notion of the library being the public square. It seems like there's a lot of pressure on the library to be things that we used to have, like public squares.
There's a lot.
Right.
I think that opens a really powerful question, because actually a lot of what we used to have is gone, and we don't have it anymore.
Say more.
And we all those things that used to be those forums of engagement and those places where the connectivity happens have become privatized or taken away. And that's the difficulty, and that's the pressure on the library. And the library, it's interesting that interior space is becoming a kind of metaphor for exterior space, because exterior space has been commodified and sold.
I mean, do you think
That's just real.
Yeah. Is there any way as in architecture to somehow gesture that there's that lack? I mean, by providing something that there should already be.
Well, I think that, there's politics, which is a different thing. We don't do that. But I think in architecture, we can respond to this. Our job is to try and, we're interested in the city. I mean, we're talking about libraries and everything, but I'm interested fundamentally in the human being in the city with this mechanism that we've invented 10,000 years ago and how it supports our life. And that we have this extraordinary densification that has changed everything because we have mass migration to cities. And so the nature of how we access information, how we have play, socialized space is completely changed. And we're not going to go backwards unless if we destroy the city and invent something else. That's a different project. So now we have to kind of create these spaces that allow these opportunities to happen. And the library has kind of found itself moving from just being a kind of palace of knowledge and of the elite, the 1%, to becoming the place where actually the greatest amount of, our community, if we believe in education as a way to kind of create, citizens, has become the kind of lens by which we kind of throw people through it into the world. So it's transformed. It's just transformed simply to do with the nature of the way the city is and the way in which densification has happened. So I mean, I love the library as a kind of romantic book stack, but that's just to do with the last 200 years or 100 years. I mean, it's let's think bigger than that. It's really a lens for kind of creating people. It was a lens for creating an elite, going back to monasteries, etc. It's now a lens for creating the greatest amount of educated people that we can make. So if that's its kind of DNA, let's not get hung up on the kind of, for me, I'm just like, let's get really, or I'm interested. I mean, okay, we can get head up on things, that's fine. But I'm more interested in the urgency of trying to create models that create the greatest amount of empowerment for the most amount of people. Yeah, that's the answer.
I'm an archivist, but also an avid sci-fi reader. And as you were talking about we do research. We're not just thinking about these things necessarily. And it really struck me of thinking about, the lessons in sci-fi, going back to, 100 years ago, Einstein was saying these things might exist, and now, gosh, today we find out they really are. And so just thinking about the lessons of history, but also the lessons of, design of libraries and design of those spaces in sci-fi over time, science fiction over time, and using that, are there architects, people doing design that are particularly looking at, how do we design something in a sci-fi book that is placed 300 years in the future on a different planet? And does that come into the conversation at all in thinking about current design?
Who's the client for that?
It was an architecture question. Do you guys think about sci-fi and architecture?
Yeah, there's some people who are really engaged in sci-fi architecture. We're not the ones, but
we're in MIT,
Yeah.
the home of sensible cities. I mean, that was sci-fi just a few years ago.
Yeah.
So yes, it's very much alive and well, and the question is where it goes next.
Well, and I don't know if the movie Mission Impossible counts as sci-fi, but that scene where Tom Cruise is moving information around, and I know that the actual
I heard you having that vision.
that's my vision.
All right, I got a signal that we have to finish. So thank you very much, our panelists, and thank you, audience. a vision of, you know how